Oh my gosh. There. Wait. That wasn't working. Let's try again. Yes, there we go. Yay. Oh, there's an error. Oh, shoot. Today is the day, huh?
Sweet.
Yep, not working. Let me refresh, okay?
Okay.
Be right back. So much fun. I love tech issues, don't you guys?
Sweet.
Yay. It's always something.
So awkward. I'm on the left now.
Yeah, is that okay? Aren't you
fine.
like politically typically on the left?
How's that relevant?
Oh my God. Hello, guys. Hey, Richard from Mendocino, Rosie from Seattle. Woo! John from Ireland. Thanks for joining us. And Victoria from the south of Portugal. Victoria, it's late for you. Portland, sweet, Jim. And Erica, all the way from the 323. Wow, that's super far, huh, James?
That's pretty far, but also
Exactly. Thanks, Rosie, for monitoring us. It's just been I don't know what's happened. We've been having a little bit of tech issues. But as you've noticed, now that you guys are back, that the UI for Crowdcast has changed. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I guess we'll talk to you, James, about that. But I was wondering if anyone in the crowd here works in UI, UX, screen-based interfaces, you work in web design, anything like that. Let us know if you work in some web stuff. Meanwhile, James and I are going to shoot the shit a little bit while we're waiting for everyone to get in. Please use the share button underneath our video to let everyone know we're getting started. So, hello, guys. I see some varsity people are here too. Yay. Good to see you guys. Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Jason from Cupertino. Is that correct? Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry if I keep messing that one up. To me, it's all the north. Okay, great. Excellent. Excellent. So do any of you work in UI, UX? Let us know. This way, James knows who he's talking to. Yes, good, excellent, very cool. Welcome. Yes, Andy does, James.
Oh, hi Andy. I know Andy.
So, James, where are you right now and what you doing today?
Today I am working from home from my house here in Tongal. So I live in a geodesic dome, which is why my walls aren't flat. Whoa. So yeah, come by anytime. So yeah, this is where I am, the fabulous city of Tahunga. Take a look.
Well, I see alcohol behind you and stuffed animals. Yeah,
well, you know the things that we need to get through the day, right?
Exactly. Teresa has the whole group of Monotype with her. Teresa, are you guys in LA or are you in San Francisco today? And what are you wearing? Type Fight Live? Let's see your t-shirt.
Oh yeah, you know about Type Fight, right?
Oh, you won, right? At Creative South?
That's right. Do you remember when where I was telling you about how I was freaking out about hand lettering because I suck at it?
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, well, what did Michael say? He said something like, oh, start with the hardest one, R.
So did you start with R?
Guess which one I got in the actual Type Fight?
I
got R.
Yes. Excellent. Very cool. Excellent. So Teresa is here from Playa Vista. She is local. Very cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. We're going to get started. Welcome to Typography Dojo. Today I have a very good friend, a longtime friend with me. It's James Su. He's kind of psycho. Hey, Eric. How are you doing? So James, I met James through TypeEd, actually. He came in, he took a class, found out that we were actually from the same alma mater. We're both from Cal Poly Pomona. And he was interested in typesetting. He was working in digital, he was working in print. You were working on a magazine for Live Nation, right?
Yeah, that was like our e-magazine at the time.
Yeah. And how did that project turn out?
Oh my gosh, so many typesetting rules that we're just taught in TypeEd that are just so applicable, right? Because think about like typesetting, it comes from it has its roots in print. So like, the concept of an electronic magazine is like, it's a no-brainer. Everything is applicable.
Right. And actually, you're going to talk about that when we talk about VR today, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll get started here. Hey, Andrea. Go Broncos. Awesome. So James, shall we get started?
Yeah, sure.
All right. You want to share that messy desktop of yours?
Oh, God. All right.
Awesome.
Please don't judge me.
Just tweet about it, guys.
All right.
James, the floor is yours.
Okay. You can see my screen, right?
Yeah, we can still see you too.
Oh, sweet. All right. So I kind of just thought I'd take a moment for those who haven't met me and just kind of talk about myself and introduce myself a little bit. So I'm James Sue, and I like to consider myself a designer and friend based here in California. So my career is kind of like a weird one. So like Rachel mentioned, I went to Cal Poly Pomona and I studied traditional graphic design there. And the curriculum there is kind of interesting because it's like a multifaceted approach in how to be a kind of like design generalist. But in terms of like how you take that and kind of go next level and apply that to both UI and UX, a lot of that learning is kind of on your own post-graduation. So I've been really fortunate that right out of college, I've been able to kind of jump directly into tech. And I've kind of worked from like one tech startup to another tech startup into like, a couple of Fortune 500s now. And so two of the most notable ones are Live Nation and at Disney. So what I've got on screen here is photos of me and my wife. I'm kind of a weird guy, and my wife is kind of a very unique person too, so she gets me. So how is that relevant? Why am I even talking about any of this stuff? So, the reason why I'm bringing it up is because I've been pretty fortunate enough to be able to take all of those experiences, and having worked on the agency side of things and having worked, having to cater to Disney on the agency side, that be really advantageous and kind of give me a leg up to actually go work at the Walt Disney Studios. And so, for those of you that are not like super familiar with Disney's internal structure, like think of it kind of like as one big giant wheel. And within that wheel, there are a lot of different spokes. So, you've got like Parks and Resorts, which is responsible for like Disneyland.com and all the Disney World stuff. You've got DCP, which is Disney Consumer Products, and actually it's called DCPI now because it's merged with Disney Interactive. So Walt Disney Studios is responsible for everything that is like kind of theatrical film entertainment delivery. So think about like all of the video on demand services. There's an entire suite of internal enterprise tools that helps get a feature film from a master file to be developed or to be sent into theaters. So so I got brought into Disney Studios. The main project that I was able to work on was a virtual reality content hub, and that project was called Disney Movies VR. Let's see, which brings me to my very first point in working on Disney Movies VR. So actually, let me jump back a little bit, and I'll give you guys a little bit more context. So as it relates to like Disney's content strategy, they're kind of like the kings of content. They've got so many different IPs, so many pieces of content, long form, short form, multi-platform. And the interesting thing about virtual reality is because it's still kind of like a pioneered platform and frontier. There, at least for Disney as an organization, before this project, there didn't exist any one consolidated content hub that housed all of that content. So part of that, the problem we were trying to solve at the time was bringing it all under one roof. And again, for those of you who aren't super savvy or super familiar with Disney, they kind of own every major animation studio underneath them now. So that includes Lucasfilm, Walt Disney Animation Studio, Pixar, and Marvel Studios.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so imagine like, okay, you've got like these 4 amazing studios, each of which is doing like phenomenal things, and you're trying to consolidate all of that content into one roof. So there's a lot of challenges there, like not only aesthetically, like how do we represent all these different studios, but like, you know, there's like actual tactical stuff like, okay, we're going to design a virtual reality experience for it. Let's, you know, go face first into all the obstacles that we're going to tackle. And so the concept that we kind of landed on was this kind of virtual world where, you know, you kind of be as a user at the top of a mountain peak, and then you could like overlook each world, and as you're kind of gazing into each one, you know, each of these cities that you'd see off in the horizon would light up, and then they'd be branded. So there'd be like a Lucasfilm world, and then you'd see like you'd maybe see some like aircraft that are flying overhead, and then you'd go look over at the Pixar world, and that city would light up, and so on and so forth. So trying to think about how the interfaces are going to play a part in all of these things, I came across a lot of challenges and obstacles, and so you know, a lot of these things aren't like super new, but like putting them into the context of virtual reality is something that I was like, hey, these are some pretty valuable insights that I'm coming up against. Maybe I should document them and share them with people, because I think people might find them pretty interesting. So the first thing is, the first point is this right here, which is print design is related to virtual reality. And the thinking behind that is, it kind of regardless of the world that you're in, whether it be, you know, actual reality, augmented reality, or entirely fictitious virtual reality, the readability of typography is relevant to your spatial relationship to it. So the important thing to leverage here is that the print world and the print medium has actually already done a lot of the heavy lifting and the problem solving. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're solving for interfaces. So what I've got on screen here is a mood board that I've created for a couple of the different aesthetics. So a couple of them are kind of cool. Like some of them are just straight up flat screens, but like, you know, if you take a look at like right in the central axis, you've got a screen right there. It's like, it says, "Are you ready for change?" I think this is for a screenshot from the Lara Croft video game. Mm-hmm. But like, you know, try to imagine this in a virtual environment where it's like, okay, if you were in this world, how far away would that text be? For you to be able to read it. So actually, let's go back. So a couple of the experiences that we designed for were specifically kind of like thumbnails and also kind of dialogues and modal windows. And the way that you solve those in virtual reality are kind of unique, because you can actually do them in a couple different ways. You can have, you know, where normally if you were designing a mobile app or a website, you could just control that via the viewport. But in virtual environment, you can have that, you know, you can have this little disk be, you know, as big as a door, or you could have it be as small as a dinner plate. So what I've got on screen is an interaction for an early prototype for how we wanted to solve exiting virtual reality content. So if you think of it kind of like in a z-axis, the world itself is kind of the most bottom layer, and then the interface is kind of layered on top. And then even more so if you go further here, this stuff here is even more like just text in the world that exists. So because it was a new medium and none of us really had like a ton of experience, we were really not conservative, but we're really generous with our typographic choices. So like we made things really big, probably bigger than it needed to be, because we weren't sure.
When was this, James, that you were working on this?
This was 2015, 2016.
Okay. So this, I mean, just designing in VR is relatively new.
Yeah, in terms of like maturity for processes, and I'll go ahead and elaborate on that afterwards too. Like,
Okay.
there don't exist a ton of tools right now to streamline the flow, and I'm sure some of you are going to have thoughts on questions like, how did you prototype in VR? So like, my team came up with a really janky process, which is, I know for certain, not ideal, but it worked for the process that we needed it to do.
Mm-hmm.
So. Oh, actually, let me go back one. All right, so what I've got on screen here is a standard billboard that you'd see if you were driving down the freeway. So I've got the Coca-Cola billboard on the left. I've got the Oculus Home Store on the right. And the reason why I'm showing you these two side by side is to draw the similarities between these relationships. Because, thinking about at what size somebody needs to see something on as they're driving on the freeway is very, very relevant to, how big elements, and specifically typography, should be in a straight up virtual environment. So obviously this same thinking applies itself not only to virtual reality, but also augmented reality. And, AR is really interesting too. And some people will classify it separately, but it's actually, in my opinion, the same thing. And the only thing that really changes is the blurring between a fictitious version of reality and a modified version of your actual reality. But, in terms of typographic skill set and typographic approaches, everything still applies, because you still kind of have to think about how far away text has to be readable, typographic font choices to convey the right emotion, hierarchies, the whole 9 yards.
Let me just remind everyone, if you have questions, put it under the questions and answers tab so we can go long form into those answers, because I'm having a couple right now. Go ahead,
Perfect.
James.
Perfect. All right. So the next point that is really important, that for those of you who aspire to work in virtual reality, this is not directly typography related, but is still a really important point. And that is to be really strategic with your targets. And so to give you some backstory, so when designing for virtual reality, you kind of have to optimize for the headset that you are going to be targeting. So, there's two buckets. There's the lower end headsets, which are like the Google Cardboards of the world. And then there's the higher end ones, which are, the Oculus Rifts and the HTC Vives. And the difference between the two is, one, the higher end ones will come with a controller, and that really changes your method of input. And so, that's a big interaction change, because if you're on a lower end headset like a Google Cardboard, the way that you would invoke an interaction is you'd have a crosshair in the middle called a reticle, and you'd have to gaze at a target, and you'd have to wait for an animation to complete for it to register as a button click.
Wow.
And so the important thing to think about there is that it's really easy if you have a really short gaze views for somebody to fall into a spiral of button clicks. So, as it relates to Disney Movies VR, we were surfacing thumbnails for 360 content. And so there's two ways to consume that. You can either stream it over your data plan, or you could download it and then watch it in its full quality. So being strategic with your button targets makes it so that people don't accidentally click into a black hole of things. Because, where if you're designing something for web right here, I've got this module, it totally makes sense to have a giant call to action right there in the central axis. But in virtual reality, that's kind of I would just be cautious about that.
Why is that, James? Can I ask?
Yeah, it's because when people look at things, we've come to find that it's their natural inclination to just focus on something in the center. And so when you're focusing on the center with gaze-based navigation, it's really easy to accidentally click something.
Okay.
Let's see, so this might be a GIF, I don't remember. Ah, yeah, it is. So this is an interaction kind of just showcasing a pyramid hierarchy for when you dive into a suite of videos for some content. So in this case, we've got the Jakku Spy series, and that actually houses 9 episodes. So one thumbnail represents the parent of these 4 children here. So you see how we kind of intentionally put things like out of the central axis.
Right.
And here's another example. So what I've got on screen here is an early iteration of the UI, and it's going through a couple of different interactions here. So it's going through downloading a stream to watch it natively. And then the first interaction that it's doing, hang on, it's been a while since I watched this thing. So the first thing that it's doing is this right here, which is, so the concept here was that we wanted to include a minimize button for users who wanted to not consume the content right away. Like, let's say you got thrown into the Lucas film world and you really wanted to just kind of sit in the desert and watch everything that was going on around you. So we gave people a minimize button, and that's right here. And so as it goes through, everything kind of animates out, and let's see.
And is that on a gaze-based navigation, or does someone have a controller?
Yeah, so all of this is early thinking. So the initial version 1 for Disney Movies VR was optimized for gaze-based navigation. And it was later on that we decided, that the leadership team decided to optimize for higher end headsets like the HTC Rift and the Oculus Vive. So a lot of this thinking didn't end up getting used in the end, but some of it got preserved.
Mm-hmm. And how large is this? Like Steve is saying that the ultra condensed type is really hard to read. So I'm wondering how small or large this is.
Yeah, no, great question. So the short answer is you kind of have to eyeball it.
You kind of have to eyeball.
And the reason why is, so like when you're thinking about typography for virtual reality, like, yes, you are designing for a quote unquote screen because you do have a canvas that's like a 2-to-1 canvas, but it kind of depends on the headset that you're targeting. So in the case of like an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift, you'd have like a really ridiculous artboard, something like 7,000 pixels by, you know, whatever the 2-to-1 ratio is. So even if you were to typeset on that, like, you still have to consume that in a virtual environment to see how big the typography comes out to be. And so like I can definitely jump more into detail because I think that that answer is definitely just opening up a can of worms for everyone.
Not a problem.
Yeah, so this is early stuff. Anyway, the takeaway is to be strategic with your targets. Here we go. So this is actually the interaction model that ended up getting used. So a couple things have changed here. One, we've got this like portal aesthetic. And the idea there was that we wanted kind of each ring to represent a different world, so you could kind of like jump into it. And so you can see a couple different things have changed in the interaction model as well. So instead of like having your buttons be side by side, they're on the right and left of the actual thumbnail themselves. So even if a user were looking at this thumbnail, they wouldn't accidentally click into a live stream or streaming version of that piece of content, or, you know, accidentally start downloading it without intentionally wanting to do that. All right, so this brings me to my next point, which is kind of touches on what we just talked about, which is it is very, very important to mock it up in VR. And the reason why is because you can make all these great typographic decisions where you know, like, to put it in context, like let's say I was designing something for a website or a mobile app, I would think of my type relationships as something like, okay, for my heads, I want to start at, 30 point, and for my body, I want to start at like 16 point. And so you'd have like all those great typographic fundamentals that come into play, which is still absolutely applicable. But, after you're setting type and it's said and done, you kind of have to throw it in that environment and still kind of eyeball it. And what I mean by that is like scaling elements up and down to be able to see and kind of target the size that you want them to be read at. And so what I've got on screen here is a spherical background. And so, this is the type of thing that like VR enthusiasts will go out and take a spherical panoramic photo, and you can throw it into a headset and kind of like enjoy that environment. And I've got the UI mocked up here on the right. And so it says 70%. And the reason why it says 70% is because I've reduced it 30% of the 100% size that I originally started with. And, a lot of it was kind of like trying to like take a stab in the dark is trying to like start out at what I thought would be a good size and kind of scaling it up and scaling it down to see, okay, this is definitely way too big. So, at the 100% size, this was like the size of a building, like a small building. And so, that's not only the thumbnails, but also the type as well. So like, obviously it's very readable, but it's definitely overkill. So it's really important to try to consume it in that same context. So, the same thinking applies to when you are working on something for web. You want to kind of consume it if, you're optimizing for a mobile viewport. And the same for like, if you're designing a mobile app, you'd want to actually see it on the device itself to see if anything weird happens.
Right. So you just can't proof it in a different, device. You have to be able to see it in
Totally.
where people would reside when they actually consume it.
Right. And so just like take a look at what I've got on screen right here. Like this kind of looks pretty good, right? Like, it looks good enough. All right, let's ship it. But like we actually haven't consumed it in virtual reality yet. So it's actually, we shouldn't ship this until we see it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of the takeaway for that. And I've got these on screen just to touch on that point. And, to give you a different metaphor, it's the same thing as like being a chef and cooking a meal, even if you've cooked the meal for like hundreds of times for hundreds of different guests, you still want to like QC and quality, or at least taste your food before it goes out to ensure that it's what you intend to deliver. So this is a really cool plugin that I learned about by writing a Medium article, and I got it shared to me as a comment. It's called Sketch to VR. And what's really cool is it takes flat interfaces and it kind of mocks them up in a virtual reality environment. So I actually haven't experimented with it to a super high degree, but it seems like a really good option for being able to find out, a lot about those spatial relationships. Because take, for example, this music screen or this music tile right here, right? It could be as large, this looks pretty big actually. So let's see, this is like probably the size of, I don't know, like half the size of a door for a house. But in virtual reality, you could have it also be as small as one of these hotel windows. And there's also depth to play with too. So, we've got it right here in front and directly in front of our faces, but we could also have it like 50 feet in the sky. And, that would also play into the typographic decision, because what looks really good right here, music, might look totally different scaled down and up in the sky. If, for some reason there was something to interact with in the sky.
So Frida, I think the plugin is called Sketch to VR.
Yeah.
That's correct, right? Okay.
Yeah. So these, I think, are a series of GIFs that play through. Yep. So mocking it up in VR. So we've already seen this interaction down here.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that one there. We've seen that one. And then this is the new one. So this one is focusing on pagination. And so check this thing out. So the important thing to note here is that even when you're hovered on it, you don't actually accidentally invoke it, because the target to actually click on it is the play button down beneath the thumbnail. All right. So, oh, whoa, kind of jumped ahead there.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so check this out. Oh my God, this is like so relevant to my world right now because I started playing Diablo 3 again. So the next point that I want to share with you guys is that it's all about the feedback. And the important thing to keep in mind in virtual reality is that you can't really anticipate. I mean, you can, but like virtual reality is pretty distracting because most of it is, you know, trying to be very interesting content. So it's important to show your users what things they can and can't interact with by giving them the feedback, specifically around hover states. So on Disney Movies VR, we optimize for size, color, and audio. So, you know, what I've got on screen here is a Diablo 3 screenshot. Looks like a barbarian who's like taking out a mob, but there's a lot of valuable design decisions here to extract. So everything from the fallen overlord demon health bar up top, showing you how much HP the fallen overlord has, to, you know, check out the 39k damage that he's doing to the mob around him. So that's kind of the point of this screen.
So what are you doing with the type though? I mean, there's the one in the middle is like yellow. I'm not sure. Is it treated differently than some of the other in terms of color?
Yeah, it looks like specifically for this. So this is a screenshot from Diablo 3. So it's not my work. But yeah, so let's jump back one.
Okay.
So how that relates is, so check this out. So watch this Kylo Ren Awakens thumbnail. So we actually size up the typography when a user hovers over the thumbnail itself. And we also increase the opacity as well. So it's really important to have that feedback because it kind of gives people a dependable set of rules that they can like count on. So like, you know, if they were hover over something, if they were to gaze at it and it didn't kind of like spring up like that, they would know, okay, that's not something I can interact with. And, you know, the same thing applies to if they hear something, like, you know, if it's a specific kind of like ring when you hover over something, that's another indicator that, hey, I can do something with this. And that's kind of just the point of that.
Okay.
So what I've got on screen here is another example. So it's from Dribble, a guy that I follow named Juhi, sorry. So a really cool thing that he's got going on here. So it's a refresh animation, and it's a drag to refresh. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. And so a lot of cool things are happening here. So the image is scaling up. You're getting a little bit of feedback that's happening up here. Elements are moving. So the reason why I wanted to share this with you is just it's another great example of a lot of feedback that's going on. Like, hey, okay, something is happening on screen, and you've got a lot of visual signifiers to share that with you. Oh, so this is actually not. So this should actually read the final point, which is the final point is not. It's all about the feedback. It's to be consistent with your UI, And the reason why I'm sharing this screenshot, this is again from another designer that I follow on Dribble. The important thing about being consistent with your interface, specifically with color and typography, is that it gives, again, your users a dependable set of rules to know what they can and can't interact with. So this is a really cool example of this mobile app here where, you know, all their CTAs are in this bright orange color and all their form fields are kind of got this like embossed kind of inner shadow to them. So it gives people that like kind of visual for it. It's like, okay, this is what I can and can't do with these components and these elements. And then how that relates to virtual reality. So check this out. So we optimized, again, to give people feedback, we showed them really vibrant pieces of color to know to share with them that, hey, this is something interesting you should interact with. And then obviously in disabled states or non-active states, they are desaturated. And so all of our major actions as well, we kind of opted at the time for this orange color for all of our buttons. So that again just gives your users a rule set to be able to say, okay, if I want to do something, I look for the orange button. And this is you know, this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but this is important for not just like mobile or product design, but also for typography. Like so many times I see like one-dimensional type, and this isn't a great example of it, but like, you know, like in gaming specifically, it'll just be like one typeface, one weight, one like very similar point sizes. And, you know, if you differentiate that, you can like really, you can really communicate more because, you know, like in UI design, there's like a pattern called titled sections. And for titled sections to actually work, they have to look like titled sections. And if they're the same size as your body copy, they kind of get lost. And at that point, they're not doing their job. And, you know, half of the form and function equation falls apart.
So in typography, I mean, how do you find, or what is your best practice for creating hierarchy other than size?
So the thing that I really like to lean on is my typographic relationships, and that's something that you know, I learned in type ed, and you know, it's thinking about like the relationships between your bodies to your heads as well as your subheads, and kind of like at what scale that those are coming in at, right? So like, you know, an example would be I want to set my heads at 30 point and I want to set my body at 15 point. So that's like that's like what, 50% of what your head is going to be.
Right. And so, but there's nothing, the tools in VR don't give you that. I mean, you don't have any numbers to go by. You said that you're kind of eyeballing those scales.
Oh,
So
right.
right. So then how do you do that?
Right. So how do you apply that? So the tactical type setting is still applicable because, okay, so let's put it into context. Like, let's say I was designing for like a Google Cardboard. My canvas size would be like 2,000 pixels wide by 1,000 pixels. So at that point, you know, all of the grid measuring still is relevant because you could still then, it's a huge artboard size, right? 2,000 by 1,000, but you could still use a baseline grid. Depending on the content that you have, you could still set up, you know, however many column grid based on your cone of focus. For those of you that aren't familiar, the cone of focus is like what is comfortable for a human to look at left to right, up and down.
Can you go back to the music tile?
Yeah, sure.
Slide and kind of maybe talk about that.
Sure. Back right. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. So where is the baseline here?
So the point that I was trying to get at.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Is that you still make those decisions up front, but you may have to scale them down, and it's, you know, probably not best practice. But the way that I practiced it is I made all of those decisions up front, and then I kind of locked them together. So the typographic decision making was still the right ratios for all of its in terms of like spatial relationships to everything else. So, I would set it, but then I would like kind of duplicate and then and keep those elements grouped together. And then depending on how large or how small I needed to scale, I would scale them as a linked elements.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And then when you're talking about cone of focus, how does that apply to what we're seeing here?
So the cone of focus applies to, so let's say we were inside this world, right? The cone of focus would be something like here. It's like something like 170 degrees. The way that it applies is it actually also is a variable in which you need to determine your grid, because let's say you have a really dense amount of information, nobody can get away from lists. You still have to think about how can I fit this list within the cone of focus. So even if you have a 16 column grid of thumbnails, you still have to keep it relevant to what's comfortable for a human being. Because as it turns out, if something is not really easy to use, people won't use it.
Right. That's true. Okay, cool. Do you have any more slides, or shall I close this one, James?
Yeah, you can close it out. I think that's everything I got.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
All right, let us know if you guys have questions. It's very abstract for me, so I'm still trying to wrap my head around working in a VR space. But there seems to be some relationships between working on screen for UI UX and just jumping into the space. But typographically, did you find anything? Did you have any insights in terms of choice of typeface? Is there any practices as far as like using display or using serifs, or there's issues with how something renders in the VR space?
I don't think I've got enough experience to be able to like weigh in intelligently in terms of like typefaces and how they render in VR. Like I didn't come across any issues, but also we played it pretty safe. What did we end up using? I don't even remember anymore. But
really thick, ultra condensed.
Well, yeah.
No serifs there.
Yeah, but I don't think that I don't know if that made it into production.
Okay.
And so, yeah, in terms of serifs, like the thing to think about too is that contrast is a really important piece of is an important variable, because even if you have just white text, like what if you have a really light environment, like let's say you're on the surface of the sun or something in some environment, white text isn't going to render very well. And so you have to think about a lot of the small, like, similar to branding, like the reason why you want to reduce more is because the small details get lost at smaller sizes.
Got it. Okay. And so, is that also like placing type over live action video? I mean, you have to put like glows around everything so you can read it on top of what's happening, because you can't really, there's no one canvas. You can't control where people are looking in the space, right?
Totally.
So how do you control the contrast?
So you can either do that dynamically in the text, in the form of drop shadows or some kind of artifact, like, maybe it's like a paint splatter, and that way you can always ensure you have enough contrast.
I see. So a background underneath the type. Got it. Okay.
Right.
Got it.
Either that, or like, specifically like in the modal dialogue use cases, you get to control that a little bit more, because like you get to kind of put like a shade over the entire environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Great. Guys, if you have any other questions, let us know. Put them underneath. We have a question from Richard. Thank you, Richard. Richard's asking, in what way or ways did you find working in VR to be unlike working in print? Good question.
Yeah. So let's see. In what ways did I find working in VR to be unlike working in print? So I think what's really fascinating about virtual reality is it touches on a lot of fantasies that humans have wanted to grasp for a very long time. And, that's like control of time, control of physics, control or ability to teleport. So I think that was kind of one of the coolest like X factors for me, is that like, hey, like I actually don't know what kind of environment these are going to live in, because it's still being developed at the same time. But I know there's like limitless possibility here.
Got it. So then what about using the type in the screen? Is it really, is it really that 100% similar, or is it?
Yeah, so in terms of similarities, it's not at all, because if I were to approach just like a regular digital product, like a website or a mobile app or something, I would know. I would have some solid like figures to be able to say what is a good readable size for an iPhone SE, for example, or an iPhone 7. Like, there's a lot of references at, this actual device that you can like pinpoint. And that's kind of similar in virtual reality, except that the target changes depending on the headset. So if you're trying to design something for the HTC Vive, which can support like, up to 4K, it's a huge difference versus like a Google Cardboard, which, is a much smaller canvas. So, I guess that's kind of very similar to like pixel density in the mobile space, where first generation iPhones are displaying pixels at 1x, but now they display all the way up to like 3 and 4x. So, God, so how do you approach that in virtual reality? There's not enough precedent set yet, because so in the mobile space, the rule of thumb, at least the way I like to practice my typesetting, is I typeset at 1x, and that means that I do not care about the pixel density your phone is able to give me. So I reduce it back all the way down to the 1 CSS pixel. And then I base all my type decisions there, and then I scale them up. So in that way, virtual reality is kind of similar, because the aspect ratio is still the same. In the ways that it's different, you don't just typeset and then like go into it knowing what you're going to get, because you really, or at least in my experience, it was like rolling the dice a lot of the time. And part of that is because it was my very first virtual reality project. I don't claim to have like a wealth of knowledge in this place. I just have the knowledge that I have.
Okay. I hope that helped, Richard. I know it's a little bit vague, but I think, like you're saying, that this is sort of new. There might not be enough user testing. We already have had, from what we know of print, we already know how the human reads. This is a completely different monster altogether, is it not?
In terms of application, yes, but like people's reading ability is still, a lot of it's still relevant.
So is this closer to like wayfinding than it is screen design?
It's a combination. It's like wayfinding, but also kind of like game design, because in a gaming environment, you have a couple signifiers that tell you things you can and can't interact with. So it is like wayfinding in that, those type of relationships are like really big, and they help you find where you are. And then it's also, you jam that in a little bit with interaction design and a little bit with game design, because like if something's interactive, it needs to have a specific finish on it. Like maybe it has like a really glossy sheen. For you to know that, hey, like anything could be interactive. Like this bear behind me could be interactive in a VR environment. Like, and I wouldn't know unless it like glowed or something.
Ah, I see. Got it. Okay. So there has to be some sort of visual indicator.
Right.
Okay. So Edgar is asking, would situated AR experiences represent a different challenge when making typographic choices? Should it be approached as if it was an environmental graphics challenge? That's kind of like what we were talking about just now, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. The truth is I haven't thought a lot about how these things apply to AR. I think my gut feeling is that a lot of it is still applicable. And, to that point, environmental graphics have probably done a lot of the heavy lifting already. So like the difference in AR is that you're not like confined. So in a lot of these 360 experiences, you're kind of confined to one point in this world. But in AR, the whole point is like for you to explore reality and have elements come with you. So it's a little bit like, I don't know, what is that hobby? Geocaching, but with like interfaces.
Where you look at something through your camera and then the interface is within the screen, correct?
Right. So a lot of the thinking is still relevant. And probably ought to be solved in a similar fashion to environmental graphics. And the reason why is because you can move closer to your target. So like, you don't have to just worry about one person being stuck in one point in space. So, it's not a great example, but like Pokemon Go, for example, you can, their targets are Pokemon. You don't need to read anything, but like you can get farther away for sure. And you can also get really close to it if you needed to.
So you're moving around with your legs. Oh, I guess it's the same as VR though, right? You move your body around, and that's how you get closer and further to elements in the UI within the space or the game.
That's true, but there are limitations too. So like for one of the high-end setups, you'd have the limitation of like just the VR environment itself, which is not very big. It's like the size of a room. But in AR, it could be the whole world.
Oh, I see.
So like you could be on one end of the park and like you could have something in an AR environment where you could like hold up your phone and you're like, oh, there's a target over there, but it's at the other end of the park. So, at that point you have to think about how does this look?
I see. Like, how does it look on the other end of the park? So you're talking about way more wayfinding considerations with AR than possibly VR, where you can control where someone goes and does not go.
Right.
Okay.
So I guess it's not a great answer, but the answer is it depends.
It depends. Okay. Ooh, this is so abstract for me. I'm wrapping my head around. Edgar, I hope we answered your question. I hope that helps. Let's see here. There's some questions on the side. Omar is asking, you might have answered this already, but is there a target font size when it comes to the cone of focus, so that's not overwhelming to the viewer?
Yeah, apologies, but the short answer is also it depends. And it depends on the content. It depends on the experience that you're designing for. So to give you some context, if I were designing, a giant virtual reality magazine, I would make some pretty different typographic decisions than I would be if, for Disney Movies VR, for example, which is thumbnails of VR content.
Got it. Okay. So there's, the target size, there's no real, I guess, because you can control or the user can control where they are in space. They can get closer to the type, which makes it larger. Mm-hmm. Correct?
Right.
Maybe the wrong person to be asking these questions because I'm still trying to figure this out.
No, that's absolutely right. So, that's kind of the reason why it's such an interesting space, right? Is because the type's still relevant. Because the way that I like to think about it always is that like typography on one hand is definitely form because it has flavor, it brings life, it communicates. On the other hand is the function aspect of things, and in that point it really needs to communicate. And if you're typesetting at a size which looks really great but is really difficult to read, you have to think about that balance. And this applies.
So you're saying that you basically need to know the fundamentals. Then when you get into the mock-up, when you live and you consume those proofs, that's when you make those decisions. So there's no guidance from the tools. Like we don't have a tool to build it that tells you, it's not readable, this is too small, or there's no like sketch for VR per se.
Yeah, so there's no hard and fast rule, Omar. Like the rule of thumb that I like to go to is it doing its job, and it does it look good? And you can answer the is it doing its job through usability testing and asking your intended users, hey, can you see that element? Could you read it for me? And then if you find that they have trouble reading it, like, yeah, I'm trying to read it, it's too small. Then you can, because at the end of the day, we all have really good hunches about what are good design decisions, but I've been proven wrong lots of times, not only by my peers, but also through usability testing, like a lot of patterns and things, design decisions that I think are going to work, totally debunked. And I find they're not they don't perform as well as I thought they would.
Mm-hmm. Cool. I hope that answers. All right. Oh, we're getting a bunch of questions. So we've got 5 minutes left. I don't know how you are, James, but we'll just go through these. So I want to just jump to the side chat bar. Lauren's asking, is there any precedence from heads-up displays that fighter pilots use?
There probably absolutely is. The reason why I don't like to bring that into uh, relationship is because I think that fighter pilot is a totally different type of user, right? They're very educated, they're very trained. And, as like a level one aviation enthusiast, like I get to take a look at some of these interfaces and I'm like, holy shit, there's a lot of shit going on in here. And like, my wife just happens to be like a World War II enthusiast. So I like take a look at what like the Mustang cockpit looks like. I'm like, man, there's a lot of shit in here. Like, how do you know what to look at? So there probably is a lot of good design decision in there. I haven't drawn from it just because I think that the audience is so much the intended user for like for example, like an aircraft pilot is very different than somebody who would like, hey, I'd like to watch a Disney VR video.
That's true. That's true. So you are thinking more about your target specifically. You mean your target audience, not your target.
Right.
So Rosie's asking, James just said virtual reality magazine. Is there such a thing?
Not that I know of, but I mean, the landscape is changing so much. So, back when I worked on Disney Movies VR, this was back in like April 2016, and that's when it like around the time that it got dropped, and so much has come out in that time frame. Like people are really hungry about this platform and really kind of driving to iterate and create successful experiences. Like at the time I was looking at other opportunities and I found out that there's an entire company that just does virtual reality home tours. So like instead of so if you're buying a house and like let's say you're super rich and you wanted to buy it in Malibu, and get this, you're so rich you can't be bothered to go out there. You're gonna put on the VR headset to tour it at home.
Wow, gosh, there is a lot of applications. So. Okay, another question here. Eric says, what percentage of your day do you spend in VR?
For me, 0%. So this is a personal note. Like, I think virtual reality is really cool, but it's also kind of a novelty. Like there are definitely applicable like utilities. Like, I read about specific case studies where it's like, oh, there's a psychologist helping using VR as a tool to help veterans come home deal with their PTSD. Like, I think that's a fascinating case study and very applicable use of virtual reality technology. For me personally, it gives me like crazy headaches and like nausea. Like I remember during the time I was working on Disney Movies VR, I was like, I went to my doctor. I was like, hey, I'm like suffering like crazy nausea. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm working on this VR project. And then he's like, is there any way you can not put on the headset? And I'm like, no. Mm-hmm. He's like, okay, well, yeah. So that's just me. And it all depends. It differs from headset to headset, experience to experience. Cause some people have like head tracking really dialed in, and then some people don't. And every experience is different too. Like some people are really considerate about their users and not moving the focus of where you are to the relationship of your environment. Like that's one thing that we found out is if you move a person too quickly, that's what gives them nausea.
Right. Oh, I can't believe you have all that control.
Right.
I hope that helped, Eric. Andy says, it seems that part of the challenge is that you can't rely on the X and Y dimensions of the viewport to control relative proportional scale. That's true because you have a Z. Instead, the Z dimension seems hugely important. Perhaps your hierarchy is proportional in the Z dimension rather than the Y and the X.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And that was one of the early questions we asked for showcasing these thumbnails is how far away are they? Are they in front of your face, or are they on the horizon line? So that's definitely a variable that's important to consider.
Right. There's a lot of challenges with VR. I mean, just people who are doing VR movies, like how do you know where the viewer is looking? So how do you develop even a hierarchy of story?
Right.
So I think, the main thing with using typography in VR is we're still in such an early like Photoshop clone phase that we're just doing whatever it takes.
Yes.
So what would you recommend someone if they were interested, if a designer was interested in getting into VR and working with UI interfaces, which is so important, right? Because you can't maneuver through spaces without having some sort of user interface?
Right. Oh, man, it's such a tough place to be in. So, so I give this like bit of advice to kids who are graduating, and the hard reality is that as a prospective employer, I'm thinking about who are you and what can you do for me right now, and how that relates to virtual reality is like, have you done virtual reality stuff, and can you do VR stuff for me right now? And so it's one of those like catch-22s. You can't get in unless you have the experience, and then you can't get the experience unless you have gotten one of these jobs before. And so, and also like like who has access to an Oculus Rift or an HTC Vive that like doesn't have like extra couple $1,000s laying around, right?
So is that why you would take like VR classes? I mean, I know those type of boot camps are starting to pop up here and there.
Yeah, no, I see them, and I haven't done enough research to give any of them my endorsement, because the truth is I don't know anything about the curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And like,
Because
yeah, I'm not sure. Like, is it one of those things that like claims to give you a quote unquote like knowledgeable training, or is it something that just like contacted the instructor the month before?
well, I'm sure that it might give you some training with the actual equipment, but I'm sure there's nothing on specifically UI, UX,
Right,
and then typography use.
right.
Um,
Wait,
I haven't seen anything like that.
so to answer your question, it's tough, but it's important to try to do a relevant project, whether it's pro bono or through one of those boot camps. But you have to have shown the proof that you have this competency and this capability, and have if there's more traction that you can demonstrate behind it, like, hey, this is a real world problem that we solved with it, not just a fancy VR thing that I did once.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's that's kind of the short answer.
Okay. You guys have any other questions? James, where can we find more of your work? And because obviously you're doing mainly UI, UX, which is not necessarily in the VR space right now, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And like what applications are you working now that that you're working on basically? Like what is your focus right now in terms of user interface
Well,
or lately?
well, lately I've been helping people problem solve filmmaking at a company called Tongal. So the latest feature that I worked on, so Tongal is a production company, and they outsource video production to filmmakers all over the world. And they have an internal team of producers who work with filmmakers from everywhere. And as in my user research, I found out that it's really difficult to do video revisions because right now it's done entirely by email, and there's a lot of like back and forth with notes, and a lot of like small details that get overlooked. So that's been kind of the biggest challenge that I've been tackling. Um, it doesn't come in like a really cool package like Disney Movies VR, because it's kind of like almost an internal tool.
Right, but you have more creative leeway, right? Than rather than working with Disney or
Yeah, definitely. So a company like Disney definitely has a lot more red tape and a lot more stakeholders. So
right, always some sort of limitations. Well, thank you guys for joining us. I hope you're able to learn a little bit about using type in VR. I know that I'm still trying to rack my brain over like how this works. I mean, I've worn a headset before, but I didn't know there were so many differences between the devices and pixel density. And it seems like there's a lot to learn, and the tools are still kind of evolving, right, James?
oh yeah, absolutely.
Right, exactly. So, just offhand, what are you using then to prepare when you're doing interfaces for VR? Do you just draw on paper, or are there digital tools that are made for the VR space?
So the answer is that it's a combination of the both. Especially like as it relates to the interaction models, you have to think, what is the content that you're displaying? How is it going to be interactive? And how is that going to animate in that relationship? So you don't really need like virtual reality tooling for that.
Mm-hmm.
Where the tooling does come into play is when you start to actually put elements into a VR space. So then you start to have to think about how big is something, how far away is it, and that includes pictures as well as typography. So in terms of like mass marketed tooling, I don't know of anything that exists because it kind of depends again on the headset. So when we decided to optimize for the Rift, we had engineering partners who, team of engineers that just put together a tool for us to say, hey, here's a .exe file that you can throw in a flat comp into, and it will populate it in a VR environment, and here are the controls for you to move it around and scale it. So like that is something they made like off the fly because they recognize like, hey, this is a tool that you need and there doesn't exist anything like it. So we made it for you.
Right. Oh my gosh. All right. Well, this is definitely a very, very niche market. So if you want to get into it, maybe start in UI UX and see where it goes. Because yeah, you're right. No one can afford those headsets. Well, thank you, James, again for for help for like racking my brain today in terms of how that works. John says he needs to research big time, as I do too, and try to. And I'm going to be sort of watching how the industry changes since it's really blowing up right now. I mean, even Apple is starting to support AR, right, through their iPhones and whatnot.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
with the latest announcement.
Yeah. So crazy things are going to happen, guys. Well, have a good day. And we'll see you guys in about 11, 12 days. We will be talking to the alphabets. Liron and Eleni will be talking about type design mentorship. So that should be fun. Well, have a good day, guys. Bye, James. Thank you.
Bye.